in 72 spaces. The aim is offering knowledge and scientific research lines and working together about the future of the city, the planet, and so on. Now that the colleagues of subtitulation and interpreting devices are getting ready, so everyone is ready to translate Ellen S. Baker's words and conference. If you ever wondered about how it is to live in the space, you will get some answers by Ellen S. Baker, who is doctor. She has been astronaut at the NASA. She has more than 600 hours in the space, and she will tell us about the effects of these missions in the body. José Ramón Calvo, who is president of the Institute of International Cooperation of the Royal Academy, European Academy of Doctors, you have the floor. Well, once again, can you hear me, Mrs. Baker? And I introduce you Ellen S. Baker. As the moderator said, she is a doctor and astronaut at the NASA. She has been acknowledged, internationally acknowledged. Whilst she was working at the NASA, she was head at the Office of Astronauts of NASA. She has taken part, as the moderator said, in 3 space missions and spent 686 hours in 3 missions. She graduated at the Bexhide High School in New York, and she pursued a degree in medicine as well as a doctorate, PhD in medicine in the University of Cornell. Also in Texas, she studied there, and after 3 years of practice, she was certified as a specialist in internal medicine. In 1981, she joined the NASA as a medical doctor, and she graduated in the aerospace course of the Air Force in San Antonio. As a candidate to astronaut, she was working in the Medical Center Johnson. She was recruited by NASA in 1984, joining the body in 1985. She has supported works at the Space Shuttle, and her first flight is at the STS-34 flight in 1989. The second one will be in 1992, and the third one was in the STS-71 in 1995. She spent more than 600 hours in the space, and she developed research works that she will tell us much more about, more than I could do, because you came here to listen to her. So,
Ellen Baker.
Gracias. Muchas gracias. Y muchas gracias por invitarme. Estoy muy feliz de estar aquí, pero lo siento, no puedo hablar muy bien en español y mi charla es en inglés. I was very, very lucky to be part of a very exciting adventure in flying in space. And we all recognize this, but from space, the Earth is magnificent. And ever since people have looked up at the stars, we've dreamed of going to space. It's part of our DNA. It's who we are. We want to explore. We want to travel. And we've always, from ancient times until recent times, we've always dreamed of traveling in space, and we've always wondered, what's out there? Who else is out there? So even though we've been traveling in space now for almost 60 years, I have to say we haven't gotten very far from Earth. It's not easy. And if you go to the movies, if you read science fiction, you think it's easy to travel in space. You get in your spaceship, you can rocket to the other side of the universe. It's exciting. You can leave your planet. There's all sorts of people you might meet out there, aliens. They're everywhere. And some of them are friendly, and maybe some of them are not. But I have to tell you, spaceflight is actually really hard to do. And it's actually dangerous. This is the crew of the Columbia space shuttle that was killed in 2003 in an accident. It takes a lot of smart people to design and build rockets and to operate them. And there are thousands and thousands of things that have to go right to make sure that you can fly to space and return safely to Earth. I don't want to put a damper on things. We've learned a lot in the last 60 years, and there's a lot more to do in the coming years. But it's science, it's engineering, and it's not Hollywood. So right now we have orbiting the Earth, the International Space Station. It's home usually to 6 astronauts from many different countries. It has been in orbit almost, like I said, almost 20 years. We've had it permanently manned with over 50 different crews. So this is really a new era of space travel, but we're still orbiting the Earth. We're not traveling too far from home. And in fact, if you look at this graph, only about 550 people have flown in space. The blue are US space vehicles, the red are the Russian vehicles, and the yellow are the Chinese vehicles. But spaceflight is still not open to too many people. And that is because it's dangerous and it's expensive. And we still have a little bit to go before it is open to the general public. Lots of people want to be astronauts. We get many, many thousands of applications for astronauts, but as you might expect, it's difficult to get selected. The very first astronauts were all military. They were all jet pilots, and they were all men. So this was in 1959, but astronauts actually are a more diverse group now. You might imagine they have to have a good education. You're required to study science or engineering. So we have astronauts who are, like me, medical doctors or geologists, astronomers, astrophysics, mathematicians, lots of different engineers, and many aviators. So that goes without saying, but there's a lot of other things that you have to consider when you select astronauts. And I was very fortunate to be on the astronaut selection committee several times during my time at NASA. And there are things that are hard to measure that are really important when you're working together in very dangerous environments and very isolated spaces. So you want crew members who you can depend on. You want people who work well together. And for all of you children out there, this is an important skill no matter what you do. It's really important to know how to get along with your colleagues, even if you don't like them. You have to learn how to work together, because the mission depends on the crew working together. We have lots of physical requirements for astronauts, but basically you have to be healthy. So it's good to be a lifelong exerciser, so you're fit, and to take really good care of yourself. We don't have US astronauts that smoke, for example, so good health is really important. Unfortunately, there are some other restrictions. You have to fit into the spacesuits. You can't be too tall, and you can't be too short. And while both of these astronauts flew on the space shuttle, Scott was too tall to fly in the Soyuz, and Wendy was too short to fly in the Soyuz. So they could not fly on the Russian vehicles. And we don't have age restrictions, but I will tell you most astronauts, having gone through school and gotten their graduate degrees and then having relevant experience working in industry or the military or at the university, most are in their early 30s to mid-30s when they're selected. John Glenn flew on the very first program, the Mercury program. He was on the third flight, the first to orbit the Earth, and he flew again in the mid-90s at the age of 77. But most astronauts are not this old. And perhaps you recognize Pedro Duque. So we have had an astronaut from Spain, and then Mike Lopez Alegria, who has one parent from Spain. But crews now are much more diverse. They're international. So we have people from Europe, Canada, Japan. We have flown an astronaut from Brazil. So a much more diverse group now, and a lot more opportunity for many different people to fly in space than we had at the beginning of the program. The early programs were really part of the Cold War, and that's what gave us the real vision to get into space. It was truly a new frontier. And the early astronauts who blasted off in these little rockets were quite brave. But the vision at that time was to get us to the moon. And remarkably, we were able to do that in less than a decade. It seems almost inconceivable to me now, seeing how long it takes to get even the simplest things through the government. And I'm sure you can understand sometimes the government moves really slowly. But we got to the moon really quickly, and we had the Cold War that really moved us and prompted us to go quickly. So I flew during the shuttle era. The shuttle was very different than the capsules that we had initially. It was a reusable spacecraft. It was going to land like an airplane. We could take a lot of cargo up. We could bring a lot of cargo back. So it really offered us a new platform and a new opportunity to go to space and do things that we hadn't been able to do before. It was big. It required a lot of energy to get us off the ground. About 2 minutes into the flight, the solid rocket motors would separate, and the liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen that were in the external tank would keep the engines burning until we got to orbit. And 8.5 minutes from the ground to orbit. So you get going really fast. And I always say that distorts your sense of time when you can go from the ground to orbit in 8.5 minutes, and it took me a long time to get here from Houston. So you get a little impatient. But the shuttle was the real workhorse of the space program for about 30 years. In the early parts of the program, we used it to launch satellites. It served as a laboratory. In the later parts of the program, it brought up all the pieces, or many of the pieces, of the International Space Station, and it served as our platform for putting the space station together. 135 missions, and our last mission was 2011. So now we go to space in the Soyuz rocket with the Russians. It's not cheap, unfortunately, but the US has not had a way in an American-built craft to get our astronauts to the space station since 2011. We hope in the next couple of years we will have an opportunity. But we fly on the Russian rocket. It is really the workhorse of the space program right now. Not brand new technology, but very reliable and very experienced. We launch from Baikonur, and it's a little bit of a different scenario than Kennedy Space Center, where we launched the shuttle. But that's the way we get there and back now, in the Soyuz rocket and the Soyuz capsule. 8.5 minutes. The engines turn off, and just in the blink of an eye, everything floats, including your hair. I always say every day in space is a bad hair day, and I don't know if that translates, but it's true. And one of the real amazing things is how fast you feel comfortable in space. Here you are on Earth, and our feet are on the ground, and in the blink of an eye, you're floating around, and you feel normal. There are a few things that require adjustment. I'd say that maybe the first 1 to 3 days, some people feel what we call space sick. It's like being seasick. But that passes, and you by day 3 or day 4, you feel pretty well. The fluid shifts around in your body, so your legs get really skinny, which is good. Your face gets puffy, which is not so good. But these are temporary effects, and your body is really amazing. It adjusts very easily and very rapidly. But there's a lot of dangers up there. I mean, I won't downplay them. Of course, in space, there's no gravity. Well, I say there's no gravity. There's a little bit of gravity, but your body can't appreciate it. There's space radiation, and we don't do a great job of protecting astronauts, actually, from the radiation in space. You have to bring your own air. You have to bring your own atmospheric pressure. There's little micrometeorites. We can avoid the big pieces that we see in space and move the vehicle if we think we're going to cross paths with a big piece of debris in space, but the little pieces we can't see. Of course, you're isolated. On the shuttle, I only flew for 5, 10, or 14 days, but on the space station, they're flying for 6 months at a time, so you're isolated. It's noisy. In the early parts of the space station, there were a lot of construction activities going on, and those are dangerous. And then during the mission, launch and landing are the dangerous times, but spacewalks also pose some dangers, and communication. Not so bad when you're in orbit, but think about when you're going to Mars, and maybe it will take 20 minutes for words spoken on Earth to get to you in your spacecraft when you're on Mars, or 20 minutes for your words to get back. So there's lots of things to consider when you're flying in space. I think it's fun. Like I said, 8.5 minutes, boom. You're floating, and up and down no longer have any meaning. So is he upside down or right side up? It doesn't matter. You have to learn how to get around. You're used to training in the mock-up of the model of the space station, but that's not how you get around when you're in orbit. So you learn how to very gently pull yourself along in the vehicle, and thank goodness for Velcro. It's everywhere, and that's good. All these little blue patches are Velcro on your food, on your cameras, on your pens, on your computers, because nothing stays where you put it unless you slap it on a piece of Velcro. And you always have a little time to play. And I will say there's a lot of traffic in space. You know, you think you can swim, but you actually can't. But you can fly if you push yourself off and you find a nice long tunnel, and you can fly through. Well, what about the simple things, the things we do every day, like eating? What's it like to eat in space? Our food is all prepackaged. It's sort of like food you might take on a camping trip. On the shuttle, it was all dehydrated, so we added water and mixed it up, and we could put it on a in a warming oven. We didn't actually cook anything, which was fine with me. In fact, I thought the food was great. I didn't have to go to the grocery store. I didn't actually have to worry about the menu. I didn't have to cook it. And then cleanup was pretty easy. Everything just went in the trash. So eating in space was fine with me. On the space shuttle, you had a fairly limited menu. This looks really terrible, but it's actually not. It's the creamed spinach, and it was actually good. But it does not look good in this picture. Our drinks all came in these foil packages. So we would just add water, mix it up, and you'd have a drink. And occasionally we would get to have fresh food, and this is how you make a taco in space. But don't do this at home. Now, interestingly, we generally don't have bread because bread makes a lot of crumbs. And so tortillas don't make crumbs, and they actually can last a long time. So you have a little bit of fresh food, and we use tortillas if we can. Bite-sized food, and lots of an opportunity to play with your food. So here's water. Here's a big glob of orange juice. And here's coffee, but in space, you can drink coffee with chopsticks. So lots and lots of fun. On the space station, my colleagues tell me they love when the cargo ship comes because there's fresh food. And they really long for something fresh, fruits and vegetables. And it's a big day. In fact, one of my colleagues told me she would take an onion and eat it like an apple, which sounds terrible, but she so missed fresh food that was just delicious. And of course, in space, you can juggle, and you never drop anything. So there you go. We have multinational crews, and so we have multinational food. And here we're making sushi in space. And the Russian food, I would have to be really hungry to eat jellied beef tongue, and I don't know how to translate that. But everybody, it's important. Mealtime is really important for many reasons, right? It brings the crew together. You have an opportunity to talk. It promotes teamwork and supporting each other. It's an opportunity to relax and talk about what you did that day and maybe what you're going to do the next day, and it's, of course, fun. But mealtime is really important, and I don't want to understate that. We try to schedule the crew to eat at the same time for at least one meal of the day, and that allows everybody to get together and relax, and it keeps the crew working together and keeps the crew harmony. So mealtime is really important. Another big part of your day, if you're on the space station, is exercise. If you're in space for a long time, anything I would say over a month or so, you're going to start to lose some of your bone mineral, so your bones might get weak. You could imagine if you're floating around and you're not walking or lifting anything, that maybe your muscles would get weak. And if you plan to go to space and never come back, that might be okay, because your bones and your muscles would adapt to being in space. But if you want to come back to Earth, it's a good idea to maintain the strength in your bones and the strength in your muscles. And so if you don't like to exercise, you will not like being an astronaut, because we spend about 2 hours a day exercising. And part of that is setup, but a lot of that is actually using the equipment. And you can see on the treadmill, if you're not connected to the tread, you will float away, but we pull ourselves down with the bungee cords, and then you can get a really good workout. And in fact, this is Sunny Williams, and she ran for 90 minutes on the treadmill, and that was one orbit of the Earth, so she could say that she ran around the Earth. She also ran the Boston Marathon. So the day of the Boston Marathon, she got on the treadmill and she ran the Boston Marathon. But yes, you could tell people you ran around the world if you run for 90 minutes, and that's quite an accomplishment. The other thing that's really important besides aerobic exercise is resistive exercise, and that's really important for your bones and your muscles. And we've had to be very clever at designing equipment that feels like weightlifting, because there's no weight, right? So you have to really be able to push and pull against resistance to get that feeling that you're doing weightlifting and to really put the stress and the strain on your bones and your muscles. And since about 2009, we've had this super duper weightlifting machine, and we have found that astronauts who use these devices regularly come back in really good shape. So it really reduces the amount of bone loss and the amount of muscle loss. And in fact, some people come back in better shape than when they left, because you're forced to exercise, whereas on Earth, it's not so much part of your schedule. We also have an exercise bike, but really this only resembles a bike in terms of the pedals. There's no seat because you're not sitting. So his shoes clip onto the pedals and he can pedal against resistance, and it's just another option for aerobic exercise. Probably the most stressful physical thing that we do in space is spacewalks. These, of course, are all outside the vehicle. The suit weighs about 120 kilograms. It's really heavy. So you can't put it on here on Earth and practice moving around in it and doing your job. And the way we actually train for this, believe it or not, is in a swimming pool. So the suit is heavy, you're heavy, but there's a lot of air in the suit. It's sort of like scuba diving. You don't actually sink to the bottom. In fact, we have to put weights on the astronauts to get them to be what we call neutrally buoyant. So they'll just kind of float about halfway between the top and the bottom. And you can see then the suit, of course, is airtight, so it protects you from the vacuum of space. It also protects you from the water in the swimming pool. But you can see now they're working on this satellite and practicing the tasks that they will have to do when they get to space. And so for every hour or so that we spend outside of the spacecraft, we probably spend 4 or 5 hours training on Earth. And this is physically demanding work. It is not easy. In fact, the training is harder than the spacewalk itself, because on Earth, in the pool, you really are moving against gravity, whereas in space, it's not quite that way. The crew inside will offer you some help, and I've been told, I trained to do spacewalks but never had to do one, but looking down at the Earth when it's 300 kilometers below you gives you an overwhelming sensation that you're falling. But not to be outdone, here's a selfie from space. I'm often asked about being isolated and what it's like if you're in a vehicle you can't leave, and don't you miss your family? And for my flights that were short, I missed them, but I wasn't gone that long. But for, this is Vladimir Titov, he was in the Mir for a year. And our astronauts now on space station typically fly for 6 months, but some fly for longer, and we have had some fly for a year. And that's a long time to be away from home. Things have gotten better as technology has gotten better. They can easily send messages back and forth through email, and we have a phone on the space station that runs, it's a computer-based phone, but reception is great, and I will tell you it's really weird to pick up the phone at your house and it's somebody calling from the space station. But you can stay in touch is my point, which is generally a good thing to stay in touch. On the other hand, when you're in space and you're working, you don't necessarily want to hear that we have a leak in the plumbing and the car is not working and all these other things, so you're worried about what's going on the ground. But, oh, there's Pedro again. You all know Pedro, right? Yes. So, so you're isolated, and you're with your crewmates, and hopefully, like I said at the beginning, everybody gets along. And we actually train on how to get along better. So before we fly, as a group, we spend a lot of time together, just in training, just the nature of going to classes and the simulator and traveling together. But we also have formal training in how to deal with the isolation, how to get along with each other, how to be a good team member, how to be a good leader, how to deal with difficult situations that are, that might arise between you and your crew members. And it's really, really important. Like I said, you don't have to like everybody you fly with, but you have to get along with them. And that's just a fact of life, and you will find that no matter where you are and no matter what you're doing. Good to have a little bit of crew humor, and sometimes it's a little bit too much humor, but this is actually the man who founded and runs Cirque du Soleil, and he has had a lot of money. So he was able to fly with the Russians. And I have lost my picture. Anyway, the psychological aspects of flying in space are, let me see if I can get past there. There we go. Thank you. The psychological aspects are not to be understated, but on the other hand, I think we've done a fairly good job. And part of that is we select people we think have a good track record for getting along with their partners, their colleagues, et cetera, et cetera. And when I was on the selection committee, I would always say to myself, wow, this guy's really smart, and he's got all these degrees, and he's done all these great things. Could I live with him for 6 months on the space station? Would I get along? Would I trust him with my life? Because there's a lot of complicated things you do in space, and you have to have crew members who are trustworthy and crew members you could get along with. And just imagine living in a small space, maybe even the size of this room, with 5 of your very best friends for 6 months, and you can't leave. Even your best friends might get just a little bit annoying sometimes. Of course, we do real work up there, and in fact, the construction on Space Station really was completed about 5 or 6 years ago. We have many, many scientists on the ground who support the experiments that we do on board. It's a busy, complicated environment, but we get a lot of work done, and we support scientists really all over the world who have experiments flying on Space Station. And I will tell you, I'm not a scientist, I'm an operator. So I understand a lot about science, but I don't design the experiments that fly in space. I am the ears, the eyes, the hands of the scientist on the ground who has proposed and had their experiment selected, and I operate that experiment in space. And we have scientists from all over the world who participate in the program. So we do a lot of work. Our day is usually fairly scheduled. Like I said, you get a sleep period when you wake up. You get a little bit of time to get ready for the work day. You've got usually about 8 hours of work scheduled, but you also have your exercise and other things scheduled as well. So it's pretty regimented. You will have a little bit of free time, but we have to make sure that we get everything done that needs to be done. It's especially important when you're flying for a long time that you give the crew a little bit of time to rest. So we give them the weekends off, and some people elect to rest and maybe read a book or watch a movie, but some people will have their own little science experiments that they want to do. We've had a variety of different instruments fly on board the space shuttle and the space station. Lots of very talented astronauts who are also musicians. But it's important to give the crew time to rest, and on space station they get it. On shuttle flights, we didn't really get a day off, but on space station, it's really important if you're up there for 6 months. Everybody wants to know about the bathroom. Here it is. I will just say it uses a lot of suction. So everything moves in the right direction. Okay, that's enough about that. We get an 8-hour sleep period. Not all of us sleep the full 8 hours. I have no trouble falling asleep. In fact, when I was up on this particular flight, I had a 1.5-year-old at home, and this was the most restful sleep I had had in a year and a half. But actually, you can see, your body assumes a kind of a neutral posture. Imagine if you're floating in the water, how your arms kind of float up and maybe your legs bend a little bit. And if you want to feel your head against a pillow, you've got to strap it down. So very restful. You find some Velcro and you slap your sleeping bag on the wall so you can sleep. Or you can just kind of float in the middle of the spacecraft if you choose. The sun comes up and goes down often, and maybe you want to cover your eyes. And on space station, everybody's got a little sleep compartment. It's not big, as you can see, but it's where you can put your stuff and get just a little bit of privacy at night. So let me talk just a little bit about going around the world, and that's lightning. It almost looks alive. It's at a speeded up rate here, but you circle the Earth every 90 minutes. And that means half the Earth is in darkness, half is in daylight. And that means going from darkness to daylight, daylight to darkness. The sun might be coming up or going down. So 16 orbits a day, 16 sunrises and sunsets. You never know what time it is because the sun is coming up and going down all the time. But the rule is take a picture. So if you're looking out the window, grab a camera, and we have a lot of them. And of course, now they're all digital, but we used to carry a lot of film. But find a good spot when you have a few minutes and look out the window and hold that camera and take some pictures. It's one of the most pleasant things that we get to do, look out the window and take some pictures. And in fact, it's important to know your geography. This obviously is a part of the world that most of us are familiar with, but you can see it's, of course, the Middle East, the Nile River, and the great big delta of the Nile. But if you put this very long lens on your camera, the detail is incredible, and you can see the pyramids. Right? So if the sun angle is right and you've got a long lens, you can see unbelievable detail on the surface. Lots of geology. I actually studied geology in college, and it's fascinating to look out the window. There's a lot of active volcanoes around the world, and I don't live in a part of the world where there are any volcanoes, so it was really fascinating to see just how many volcanoes were out there. It's the Galapagos. And of course, weather. I always preferred when it was clear because you got a nice view of the ground, but of course weather is everywhere, and hurricanes are terrifying to watch from the ground, but really beautiful to watch from space. Lots of other weather, sandstorms. This is a sandstorm coming off the coast of the Sudan in Africa. And in fact, you can see storms, sand coming off of Africa, heading west over the Atlantic and eventually dropping some of that dust on the shores of the United States. Glaciers almost look alive. Mountain ranges, this is the Andes Mountain and Chile there at the bottom of the screen. But beautiful, beautiful shots of the mountains. Also a lot of man-made evidence there. You can see the gray of the city, and you can see smog and evidence of human life, but certainly fires, a lot of burning and deforestation going on around the world. This is in Brazil, I think. And then just the magnificence of looking out the window and silently gliding around the globe and heading into the Mediterranean here. And of course, Gibraltar, and you can see the rock, Gibraltar in northern Africa. Barcelona. Everybody see Barcelona? Yes? In case you didn't see it, here it is, a little closer. But Google Earth has taken some of the gee whiz away from these pictures, but it really is magnificent to look at from space. Again, an orbital sunset, and even though it's dark out, when you're on the dark side of the pass, there's beautiful, beautiful things to look at. I grew up in New York City. There's a lot of ambient light. I never saw the aurora until I went to space. And it's unbelievable. It's almost like you're flying through it. So it's spectacular. I guess you don't see it here either. But again, all of Spain in one picture. So very, very beautiful. And you can see the very thin layer of the atmosphere there at the top. So that's Madrid. Very beautiful at night. And the cities at night are really quite spectacular. Here's Italy in the day and Italy at night, so you really get a sense of the shape. And London. You know, we say we can't see borders from space, and that's generally true unless you're flying over India and Pakistan, and then you can see that the border here is lit. But in general, there are no borders, and looking down on Earth, it's so beautiful, and you think, how is it possible that we're not getting along and that we don't all, work well together? How can there be so much violence and hatred? Because it's such a beautiful sight, and you can't see the borders between countries. So here's another border. This is North Korea. Pretty amazing. So South Korea well lit, China well lit. No lights in North Korea. Pretty amazing. Again, just the beauty of the Earth is magnificent, like I've said, and it almost looks like an artist had something to do with what you're looking at when you look out the window. Spectacular views, just normal geography, but really in a very beautiful light from a very beautiful vantage point. This is Botswana, a very famous river delta in Botswana, and irrigation circles in Brazil. This is in the United States, agricultural fields up in Idaho, and ski slopes. So beautiful, beautiful views, almost like an artist had something to do with them. Sand dunes in Africa and the coast of Namibia. The Great Barrier Reef. It was really a privilege for me to look out the window and see the world from this view. That's in Poland. So coming back to Earth, after being in space for a short time, is not all that taxing. After 5 days, I adjusted pretty quickly. Coming back in the shuttle was pretty smooth, sort of like landing in an airplane. A little bit of a steeper approach to the runway than you would have in an airplane, but still very smooth and very gentle. Landing in the Soyuz, not quite so much, right? So you're in a capsule, about a second or two before the Soyuz hits the ground, they fire some rockets to slow down the descent rate, but there's still quite an active descent rate, as you can see on that last picture. However, we haven't hurt anybody in a landing like this on the Soyuz, so it's a lot more of a thunk and a hit the ground than with the shuttle. If you're in space for a long time, like our astronauts now are on the space station, the recovery is a little bit more prolonged. So very variable, everybody's different. Some people can stand up and walk and feel pretty good relatively quickly. Others require a day or two really to get their feet on the ground, to regain their balance, and to get rid of this tumbling sensation that they might have. So it's getting out of the Soyuz after a 6-month mission. You take it slow. Even if you've done a good job exercising, you feel like you weigh 1,000,000 pounds after being in space, even for a short time. The gravity feels oppressive. But we have a rehabilitation program. So for 6 weeks or so after you get back from space station, you're back in the gym, very much like you were when you were exercising on orbit, but you're working to regain your strength, to regain your muscle strength, to make sure your bones are strong, and to help adjust to gravity. So it's like a rehab program you might have after, let's say, you have some kind of a medical problem. So I'll just end up here. Another beautiful picture of Spain, but like I said in the beginning, we've been flying in space for a long time, but we haven't gone very far. So, the previous lecture we talked about planets that are really far away. We have a lot more exploring to do and a lot more distance to cover. And hopefully some of you in the audience today who are still in school will figure out how to get us further and faster, because that's really the issue. This was taken on the way to the moon. This is not what it looks like from the space station. So that's, the moon is the farthest we've gone. A trip to Mars could be 6 months there. You might spend a year and a half on the surface so the planets all align, and 6 months back. I like to tell people that space travel looks easy in the movies, but if you wanted to travel to the star closest to our sun, it would take 72,000 years. So we need a better way and a faster way and new technologies to help us do more exploring. This is one of my favorite pictures. That's the Earth, as seen from Saturn, 900 million miles away. So we are just really a tiny blue dot, and the universe is vast beyond comprehension, and there's still so much more to explore. Thank you. Or should I put this on?
Bueno, después.
Well, after this marvelous presentation, now it's the turn to the audience. I am sure that many of our youngsters will be willing to raise some questions. Who is the first?
Alguien que le lleve el micrófono. Hay una persona aquí delante. Bueno, ya tiene el micrófono.
There is someone just here, yes.
Ya lo tiene, pues perfecto.
Okay.
Yeah, a question in English, if that's okay.
Just how you were talking there at the end about how, we need to continue our exploration and all these things. It's amazing to see in an organization like NASA, it's all different countries working together, and it's quite inspiring to see. There's possibility, of course, in the future about this being done by private organizations and by companies, and does this concern you at all, or do you hope that we will still be able to continue to work together, or do you think it will become more and more competitive, space exploration in the future?
The space is really big, and we certainly hope that other people get involved in helping to develop technologies and access to space. I do hope we always work together. I think a little competition is good, but for some of the things that we're thinking about doing, for example, sending people to Mars, I think that has to be done by a multinational team with buy-in from the governments. It's too expensive for a private company to do, I think. Certainly they can help us develop the technologies we need, but orbiting the Earth, I think, is something that could be done independently by commercial companies, although, who are their customers? It's expensive to maintain, but I'm all for everybody jumping in and participating. But I think the long-term trips, the exploring space and going to Mars needs to be something that we do as a planet.
I agree.
Había una persona ahí que quería.
Yes, one more person over there. Yes, may you raise your hand so we can see you. And afterwards, two ladies.
In relation to this, what do you think about SpaceX and Elon Musk as a whole?
Say that again, I'm sorry.
What is your opinion about SpaceX and Elon Musk as a whole, like his
What's
ideas?
my opinion of SpaceX and Elon Musk? I don't know Elon Musk. I think SpaceX has done some amazing work so far. And I'm anxious to see what they're going to do in the near future. So they're fairly close, I think, to being able to have a vehicle with people in it. And we'll see how that goes. I'm not involved in NASA anymore, so I don't have a lot of detailed knowledge about it, but they've done some good work this last few years.
Hola. Dues preguntes.
Yes, I have a couple of questions. The first one, when I saw some of the crew playing instruments, I am a bit ignorant, and being in the space, is the sound modified? Is the sound, the music sound altered? And the second question is, you told us about alterations in the registration of time, in time feeling. I am wondering, are there other alterations such as memory or hallucinations? I mean, to which extent the conditions in the space can alter our consciousness?
If the sound is affected. When she was talking about when you show some musical instrument playing, and then if sound is affected in the condition of the space shuttle. And the second question is about if there's some kind of alteration in memory, in consciousness, etc.
Okay, the sound is not affected. It's the cabin pressure is very much like it is here on Earth, and so the sound is the same. There's a lot of ambient noise, but the sound is no different. There's not a lot of difference in your memory and your cognition and your thought processes. We've done a lot of studies to look and see if those things are affected, but there's really not a lot of issues. So your medical issues and your physiology in flight, once you adapt, is very stable. And so people are able to get their job done. Clearly we can do very complicated and technical jobs when we're in space. We have a good track record of completing our activities and doing them well. So really that's not an issue.
Sorry, my English it's not good. M'agradaria saber quan trigarà.
I would like to know how much when the space station will be obsolete. Is there a forecast of continuing with another one?
The space station is getting older and older and older. Yeah. Is it prevision of a new one, or?
I don't think that we are planning to build a new space station. And you're right, it is getting old. The Mir space station only lasted about 15 years. That's the Russian space station. And parts of our international space station are the same parts that were on the Mir space station. However, we examine and certify the elements of the space station fairly regularly, and it's holding up okay. But it is getting old, and I don't know what the plans are, let's say in 5 years, when you know, when perhaps we can't live there anymore. I hope we have something to replace it or a new mission in space.
Number two is, we need to synchronize number two to get the translation. ¿Alguna pregunta? Sí, por ahí había.
Any more questions?
Got the mic here. Yeah, my question is, because it is so hard to become an astronaut, at what point did you get that ambition that that's what you wanted to do as you were going through your medical training? Because reading about your background, it didn't, you know, you didn't go directly into aeronautics, you weren't a pilot. So I was just curious about, you know, at what point you started thinking about that as your possible future?
That's a great question. When I was growing up in New York City, there were many things girls did not do. I could not go to the math high school in New York City. Only boys got to go to the math high school. I couldn't go to the technical high school in New York City, Brooklyn Tech. Only boys got to go. I couldn't go to the Air Force Academy. Only boys could go to the Air Force Academy. Things are much different now, right? So girls have all those opportunities now. I never thought about being an astronaut because it just wasn't possible. So it wasn't until I actually was finishing medical school that I saw a little article in the newspaper that said, NASA selecting new astronauts, women and minorities urged to apply. And it started something. And I decided after medical school I was going to do my postgraduate training because I thought that was really important. And after that I went and worked at NASA as a medical doctor and then applied to be an astronaut. But the women in the program today, they grew up wanting to be astronauts. So I think there's a lot more opportunity for everybody now to have that dream and that vision. And we have people who applied to the program 4 or 5 times before being selected. So persistence is a good quality. But certainly excellence in what you do in your job and excellence in your education, but also persistence and set your goals and really try to go for them. And even if you don't get to be an astronaut, there's tremendous opportunity to do exciting work in the space program and the unmanned program and the manned program. I mean, it's just an open, wide field for anybody with the interest.
Hi, good morning. You have talked about radiation, and I just wanted to know that if you, while you're doing spacewalks, or while you are in the ISS, how can it affect you?
I didn't understand.
How is affected when the spacewalk? How is affected? Which one? Can you repeat?
Yes, how the radiation affects you?
The hydration effect.
No, the radiation.
Huh?
The
radiation.
Radiation, okay.
Radiation, okay. That's a complicated question and a complicated answer. We're lucky that we're protected from a lot of the bad space radiation by the magnetic field around the Earth. But if we're up in space for a long time, it ends up adding up. Once we really leave Earth orbit, we'll be much more at risk for bad effects on our bodies due to radiation. But the spacewalk is actually not a lot different than being inside the vehicle as far as radiation, believe it or not. So radiation for my flights was really very small. Radiation for the guys who went to the moon was a little bit longer, and for those who are in orbit for 6 months or a year, it adds up. It will be a big issue when we travel to Mars. What happens with radiation that we're mostly worried about is that it increases your risk to develop certain kinds of cancers. And so we don't want people to go to space and then come back and get sick because of their space travels. So radiation is actually, how to protect astronauts from radiation is actually a big challenge. We haven't quite figured it out, but we're okay in low Earth orbit right now.
Hello. Do you think there's life outside the Earth?
Do I think there's...
Do you think that there are life outside the Earth?
Absolutely, there's life outside the Earth. Will we ever find it, and will they ever find us? I don't know. The universe is so big, and all those other planets are so far away. Think about how long it takes the light from some of the suns, from the exoplanets. It takes light from those suns maybe 600 years, 1,000 years, 1,000,000 years to get to us. So it might be a long time before we ever discover who our neighbors are out there.
Hi, nice talk. My question is about space debris. So the increasing amount of space debris could prevent in the future the space travel. I mean, all these things are around orbiting the Earth that could prevent the spaceships to go to the space because there's a lot of debris there. Do you understand?
I didn't quite understand that.
Space debris. So
space debris.
Debris, yeah. Debris. The increasing amount of space debris could prevent in the future space travel, that we can not go outside the Earth because there's a lot of stuff there that if you go there, it will crash on our space.
Yeah, you know, there's a lot of stuff in Earth orbit from old satellites, and you know, every now and then one of them blows up and it leaves a lot of little things up there in orbit. The Air Force will track big pieces, not that big actually, 1 meter by 1 meter or maybe even smaller, and we have done some maneuvers to move the space shuttle and the space station out of the way of debris. It's the little things that we can't see that we're particularly worried about, especially things perhaps that are not even in orbit but are coming from outside the Earth orbit and moving very fast. If you look on the exterior of a vehicle that's been in Earth orbit for a long time, you will see lots of little impacts. So people have proposed going, taking, let's say, a cargo ship to orbit and cleaning up the orbital debris, but I don't know how possible that is or how close we are to doing that. It's a definite risk. There are things you can't predict and there are things you can't control. We go by the big sky theory. There's a lot of room up there and hopefully nothing bad will hit us.
¿Alguien más que tenía el micrófono por ahí? Bueno, aquí hay una persona que quiere, a ver si le pasan el micro.
Yo tengo micro.
Vale, pues usted pregunta y después se lo pasamos.
Can I ask? Someone's going before. Me? Okay. At the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned the most important problems or issues that you find on space, and radiation was mentioned in it. So, do you think is the most dangerous thing that astronauts have to deal with, or which one do you think it is?
The most dangerous part of spaceflight so far has been launch and landing. If you can make it to orbit safely and make it back safely, that's a good thing. All of the accidents have been either on launch or landing for the Russian and the US program. If you're in space for a long period of time, I think we have good protective methods for your bones and your muscles. Radiation is still a problem that we have to do some more work on. It's very hard to shield against the kind of radiation that we're exposed to in space.
Yeah, does Mars have a magnetosphere, same as we have on Earth? So astronauts will have, that they won't have to deal with, I mean, astronauts will have to deal with radiation in their trip to Mars, on their trip, or also when they like land there. I'm asking that about. Yeah,
I think both. I don't actually know what the radiation environment is on Mars. Maybe somebody else in the audience.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think there's several issues also for living on Mars that we didn't talk about and that I'm probably not totally qualified to answer, but certainly the trip to Mars is a concern.
Okay, and one last thing, I'd like to hear if you could tell me a peculiar advice or curious tip when becoming an astronaut, besides not smoking.
You know, I never say, well, let me take that back. For people interested in being astronauts, particularly kids out there in the audience, study real hard in school and do your very best and find something that you really love and go after that. Don't do things you don't like, thinking that that will help you get to be an astronaut. You know, life is long and there's many interesting paths that you can take, but do your very best and always do your very best at whatever job you're doing. Make sure you know how to get along with people. Be a good team player, be a good leader when it's appropriate. Take good care of yourself. Don't smoke. Exercise. Do all those things, you know, to take care of your health. And then go after your dreams, whatever they might be.
Thank you.
There is one crucial topic you have mentioned in one of your first slides, that is the circadian rhythms. I think it's more important, and you don't have mentioned too much. I want to know or wonder if how can affect the day-night period, because it has proven nowadays that it can affect more than we know on the body.
Yeah, no, I didn't talk about that, but yeah, circadian rhythms are totally disrupted for a number of reasons. Before the space station era, when we were flying on Space Shuttle, we generally had a small launch window during each day, and it wouldn't always be in the morning when you wake up. Sometimes we had to shift our sleep-wake cycle 12 hours to accommodate being awake and ready to launch at the particular time. And so there are a few ways you can do that. We have bright light therapy, so we can switch your normal rhythm by exposing you to bright lights and then darkness at particular times, and so you make that physiologic change. And we did this a lot on the shuttle program. We do it somewhat on space station, but the light level in general is very low on space station, and so you don't get those normal physiologic signals for alertness and for sleepiness. But what we are putting on the space station are LED lights where you can vary the light frequency from red to blue, etc. So it's much more of a physiologic stimulus to promote alertness, or not so much to promote sleepiness, but to keep you from getting that continuous alertness input when it's time to sleep. I would say sleep medications are probably the most commonly used medications in space. So a lot of people take sleeping pills, particularly at the beginning of the mission as they're starting to adjust, or melatonin or something else. But I think we've learned pretty well how to manage that through exposure to the right amounts of light.
I have a question. As you work at NASA, what is how is the state of the Orion mission program, the Orion program?
How is the Orion program going?
Yeah.
I'm not 100% sure. I think the plan is to fly a crew on Orion in about 3 or 4 years, but I can't tell you the exact details. I think before that we will have one of the commercial ships, either a Boeing or a SpaceX ship that will be able to carry astronauts to the space station. But there's a lot of things going on at the same time, and I don't know exactly where we are with the Orion program right now. Sorry.
Un jovencito y una señora.
Sí. Ho faré en català.
Yes, I will ask my question in Catalan.
Quina és la cosa més important?
Which is the most important thing that you've learned in the space, being in the space?
Wow, that's a big question. I think the most important things I've learned are that we're very fortunate to live on a beautiful planet and to have beautiful and wonderful colleagues, and we should all get along. Something I knew before I flew in space, but watching the Earth and working with my colleagues really reinforced how important it is to work together for the good of each other and for the good of our planet.
La señora ahí.
Buenos días. Durante esta semana salió en televisión que un científico dijo.
On TV, I could see that a scientist said that a space shift was approximating our planet, and to which extent these news are credible.
A spaceship. I would say it's not credible. We've had some near misses with asteroids and meteors and things like that, but as far as I know, there's no spaceships headed our way.
Probably not. Había micrófono por ahí también, una señora que lo pidió hace rato. Sí. Señor y la señora.
My question is, space has been seeping back to the public conscious lately we got news of Space Force, we got the Lunar Orbital Platform Gateway, we got like Falcon Heavy last year. So how do you manage, what are your expectations for spaceflight in the future? Will we see humans believing low Earth orbit again with all the investment in that? Or are we going to stay for another 20 years in low Earth orbit?
Those are great questions, and I have no answer. I hope that we continue to invest in space travel, and I hope that we have missions beyond the International Space Station. My hope would be that we would build a habitat on the moon and learn how to live for long periods of time on another planetary surface, and then use that knowledge to send people to Mars. The moon would be a great testing base because it's so close to Earth and you can get back and forth quickly. But I cannot predict what the US government is going to allocate for space flight, but I do hope that we continue to support human and unmanned space science.
I have a lady there and then a gentleman there.
Thank you very much for sharing your experience, and I have a question. You've said that you have felt so lucky of being able to be outside, seeing the Earth so beautiful. You have been trained to come along very well with all your team for the best of the mission. How do you feel when you come back to Earth and you realize that we are still arguing and worrying, and the worst thing of all, we are putting our planet in danger in such a foolish way? And do you think that your experience as an astronaut and the experience of your colleagues could be a very good teaching for the rest of the humans, because we all have to learn to come along well, even the differences in our small spaceship, which is the Earth. Our mission is a little bit bigger than yours, our spaceship maybe a little bigger, but at the end of the day, it's also a spaceship in the space. How could you help us?
Yeah, it's a lot of responsibility. Being in space is magical. Coming back to Earth, it's like back to Earth, right? About 6 hours after I landed, after my first flight, I was back at home, and the cat threw up on the rug, and I had to do a load of diapers, and, it was back to reality. Nobody was going to do any of that for me. How to promote peace and how to promote us to get along, I have no idea. You're a great audience. I'd be preaching to the choir, right? How do you convince people who don't want to listen that maybe there's a better way to move forward? I don't know. But I hope collectively we can figure that out, because otherwise the future can be very frightening.
Hi, Alan. Thank you for such a fascinating talk and conversation. And I think it's interesting that so many people have had questions and so many people have wanted to talk to someone that's been in space, maybe as part of the answer to this question. And also a couple of questions, someone already touched on it, but I wanted to go further into this idea about the experiments in space that you were talking about, that you're an operator of other people's experiments. But I also want to present the idea that when you're in space, you are also the experiment. You all the time, the people in the space station, space shuttle, you're being experimented on to see how the human body and the human mind react. So partly it's about how you feel about that, and also in the context of the increasing sophistication and cheapness of kind of robotic space exploration, the rovers, the landers, the deep space probes, and the sophistication, that technology that brings that information back to us. How important is it that we keep that human perspective in space?
Yeah, we're always subjects in experiments. It's part of the job, and at any one time on any one mission, you might be a subject in a dozen different experiments. It's important to have a good understanding of how spaceflight affects the human body and how you adapt going into space and how you readapt coming back to Earth. So that's just part of the job, really. I think there's plenty of room for both unmanned and manned exploration. Obviously, there's many places that robots can go that we can't go because they're too dangerous. The mission is too long, it's too far away, there's too many other dangers. On the other hand, robots can't do what we can do, right? They're not quite equipped to behave as human beings at the moment. So I think the human perspective is really important. I'm sure you remember some of the Martian rovers, Spirit and Opportunity. They were actually really small. They're about this big, right? And they didn't travel very far on any one day, and in fact over a long period of time. I mean, they just could not cover the real estate that we could cover, let's say, as we did on the moon. So I think there's an opportunity to use sort of the best of both systems, both the robotic and the manned, and maybe bring them together.
Yep. So first of all, thank you for this wonderful conference. And so I wanted to ask you a personal question, the first time in my life that I get to ask a real astronaut. What would be your favorite space movie? And that could be, and that could be one of the ones that tell a real story, Apollo 13 or First Man or so, but also science fiction like The Martian, Gravity. Where do you see yourself? What do you think is the space movie for you?
Oh, geez. I would say before I was an astronaut, I loved Star Trek. But honestly, since I've been an astronaut, it's hard for me to watch movies where spaceships blow up and where the laws of physics are absolutely disregarded. So I don't watch movies like Interstellar and Gravity. The Martian was actually a cult favorite of the astronaut office, I will say. There was a little bit of Hollywood in there, but there was enough real science and reality that we all kind of liked it. And in fact, there's one guy in the astronaut office, Don Pettit, who would clearly be the Martian. This is the guy who you put on Mars and he'd figure out how to do everything. So that was a bit of a cult favorite. I like the documentaries, Apollo 13, The Right Stuff. They were a little glitzy, but they told a really good, exciting story in a way that I think people found gripping. And anytime we can tell a real story with the real adventure and get other people to feel that adventure and to feel that excitement, I think that's a good thing.
¿Hay alguna? Sí, por ahí hay un señor que quiere una pregunta.
Some more questions over there?
I am apologizing in advance because my question is very small. Here we have had questions about great questions like Mars travel, peace on Earth, etc. And my question is very, very small and very specific. But I have not usually the opportunity to ask an astronaut about things. So my question is, we have seen a photograph of 3 astronauts reading, and their body orientations were completely different. And I have always wondered, how does the perception of 3-dimensional surroundings work in space? Because you don't have gravity, you don't have clear reference. In the absence of direction or a preferred reference, how does that work? The up and down depends on the direction of your body. You can choose deliberately an up and down and stay with that and change it if necessary. How does this work in space?
That's a good question too. I think in the beginning of your flight, most people will maintain an orientation that they're familiar with. So we train in a simulator, a mock-up of the space station or the space shuttle, and people will maintain that orientation. But over time, you find it doesn't matter, and the longer you're up there, the more interesting it is to look at things upside down, sideways, whatever. And the folks on space station will tell me, really, it takes a month or even more to feel totally at home and know when you open your eyes at any one moment what you're looking at and how to get from there to someplace else. Because when you tilt your world like that, you can actually sort of get lost. You can't, here I am, how do I get to the other module? I'm not really sure. But I think it's learned, and as you become more comfortable in the environment, you're very comfortable with the 360-degree perspective in any which way. I could tell a little bit on my 14-day mission that the longer I was up there, the more comfortable and the less I needed to maintain any kind of an orientation. I would just choose sort of the shortest path between A and B.
Thank you.
¿Alguna otra pregunta por ahí? Por aquí hay una y allí hay otra.
Okay, thank you. We are concerned about the garbage built up in the Pacific Islands, and when thinking about the solution, some people have proposed throwing that garbage into the space. It seems that now that we have polluted the Earth, we want to do the same thing to the space. What's your position in that situation? Do you think that it's a feasible option?
It is not a feasible option to throw our garbage into space. It's too expensive. I think we should do a better job of getting control of our garbage here on Earth.
Thank you. ¿Alguna otra?
Hola, moltes gràcies per...
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for talking us about a thing from so far and approaching it to us, which is the maximum time space that an astronaut can be in the space or has been in the space, and vis-a-vis the moon, which has been your great conquest. Do you think you can play a role in No, do you think the moon can play a role in the space race?
The longest anybody has flown in space on one mission is 15 months. That was Valery Polyakov, a Russian cosmonaut, many years ago, actually, about 25, 30 years ago. I think we will lengthen our missions incrementally, but we know now that we can handle a year in space, given our exercise, our nutrition, et cetera, et cetera. So I think incrementally we'll be able to lengthen our stays. Eventually, if we're really going to take a long trip, we might think about artificial gravity, where you would actually rotate your vehicle and build up a little bit of a gravitational-like force, but to strengthen or keep your bones and muscles in good shape. But for now, we're not planning on going anywhere that requires that long a trip. And the moon, I think, should definitely be part of our plans. Like I said earlier, it would be a good place to learn how to build a habitat, how to live on another planetary surface. You might say, well, you've been to the moon, why would you want to go back? But the longest mission we had to the moon was only for 3 days. So it would be good to learn how to live there for 6 months or a year at a time, perhaps. Develop the technology. It's a place to make your mistakes before you go to Mars, because once you head to Mars, there's no turning back.
Tenemos tiempo de una última pregunta.
Hola. Bueno, sí. Moltes gràcies. Jo volia saber...
Thank you very much. About your discoverings, I would like to know if there are some secret investigations, and do you have to swear anything before you start your investigations?
There are no secrets.
No.
No secret investigations. At one time, we did fly military payloads, military experiments, and those were secret. And even though I was in the astronaut office, because I was not on the military mission, I didn't know what they were doing. But in general, no, we're very open with our information. We're fairly open with a lot of our technology, and the results of all of our scientific studies will hopefully be published so that they can be shared with the rest of the scientific community. As a scientist, if you don't publish your findings and you never share them, you haven't really made progress. I think it's a requirement of any scientist doing work in space to share their science and their studies so that others can benefit from it.
The very last question, there are...
Okay, so I'm studying science now, and I'm often asked about why do you do that, and I usually don't have a good answer about, well, when people are off the field, do you understand? And I was wondering if you could just give a quick answer to why do we go to space and what are our future plans?
Yeah, well, let me start by saying people overestimate how much money we spend going to space. In the United States, the space program is 0.5% of the federal budget. If you ask the general public, they think it's so expensive, and it is, but it's a small part of the budget. And from that 0.5%, we get a very big return. We get the Kepler telescope, we get the Hubble telescope, we get the International Space Station. We have a lot to show for the money that we spend in new knowledge, in new technology, and those sorts of things. I tell people the Health and Human Services Department in the United States spends the NASA budget every 7 days. So you have to remember you're spending a lot of money, but it's a small part of the government's money. And as far as studying science, I mean, I studied it because I loved it, but I also studied it because I think it's important, right? We all enjoy the comforts and the benefits of technology and science, and without people who study science and make discoveries, we wouldn't have a lot of the things that we take for granted today. I studied medicine, and perhaps that The rationale for that is a little bit more obvious. I want to, take care of people who are sick and make them better, or perhaps develop new medications or new technologies to help reduce illness and reduce suffering. But, science and the quest of knowledge, I think, are part of who we are, and we certainly have put it to good use.
Bien, para finalizar, yo debo decirles.
I have to tell you that Dr. Helen S. Baker, when she retired from NASA, she decided to devote her life to help others. She is helping women suffering from cancer in South Africa and in Mozambique, where she's going to fly the day after tomorrow. One of the things she brought to us is the view from the space, from the point of view of a technician, a medical astronaut, and now that she's on ground, she's helping those who need her the most. And she deserved our applauses. Thank you very much for giving her such deserved applause. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ellen S. Baker, for sharing her experience with us, and to Jose Ramon Calvo. Tomorrow at 5 p.m. she will take part in a roundtable about the challenges for the future. I know that I recommend you not to eat too much, because we are going to talk with Pere Castells. He has collaborated with Bullitayi and the Alicia Foundation. He will tell us what we are going to eat in Mars in the future. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening.